Welcome. I see folks starting to log in. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes to just sign on here, but we'll get started by about 6:05 New Orleans time. Welcome, folks. I'm just going to give it a few minutes as people log on before we start tonight's lecture, but we will get started at 6:05 Yuletide and Dixie lecture. Welcome, everyone. We are just going to give it a couple more minutes as people log on before we start tonight's lecture, Yuletide and Dixie. We'll get started by about 6:05. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give it one more minute as people log on for the Yuletide and Dixie lecture. We'll get started at 6:05. All right, I think we are going to get started now. Welcome and good evening. My name is Dr. Amy Catherine Medvick, and I am the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves two 19th century New Orleans homes and, through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. And we invite you to come visit us next time you're in the French Quarter. And I'd also just like to say we've had quite the evening here in New Orleans. We had a tornado touchdown in the city a couple of hours ago, and thankfully I'm okay. I think our houses are okay, but our thoughts are with folks out in Gretna and Arabi and everyone else that was affected by the tornadoes coming through. And hopefully they're able to recover quickly. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Emeritus of History, Robert E. May taught Southern history in the Civil War during a 46-year Purdue University career and is known internationally for his books about Southern attempts to expand slavery into Latin America before the Civil War, especially the William Walker invasions of Nicaragua, some of which were based largely in New Orleans. His book, John A. Kittman, Old South Crusader, earned the book prize of the Mississippi Historical Society, and his book, Slavery, Race, and the Conquest in the Tropics, Lincoln, Douglas, and the Future of Latin America, was a finalist selection for the Lincoln Book Prize. Yuletide, upon which tonight's lecture is based, was first published in 2019. In tonight's talk, Dr. May, drawing from documents he uncovered in writing Yuletide and Dixie, Slavery, Christmas, and Southern Memory, will not only provide a far more disturbing picture of enslaved Christmas experiences in New Orleans and other Southern cities, as well as on plantations than most Americans have been exposed to, but also show how misleading myths and simplifications about holidays during enslavement have exacerbated U.S. racial divisions for 150 years. To talk about Christmas gifts to enslaved people without compensating allusions to Christmas abuses of their bodies and spirits, he will argue, is not to understand the holiday's meaning at all before the Civil War. And I would like to add, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end of the lecture at around 6:45 to 7 o'clock. That'll go till 7:30 New Orleans time. If you could submit your questions into the Q&A function on the webinar rather than the chat, that would be much appreciated. That allows us to consolidate all our questions in one place and make sure that we're getting to everybody's questions. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert May.
Hi, Amy, and hello, guests. I'm honored to be part of the Gallier gatherings. And let's see. Okay, I'm all set. I want to start by taking you back in time to right before Louisiana became a state, the Christmas before, in fact, to Christmas Eve, right before statehood for Louisiana. And on Christmas Eve, and let's see, I need to get to slideshow, so let me do that. Okay, there we are. Let's see. Let me do this. Slideshow. Okay, now this should work. Okay, there we go. So it's Christmas Eve, 1811, and you've got here a governor from a letter from the territorial governor to a colonel in the Orleans territorial militia. And he writes, "Dear sir, The news which reached me on yesterday of a spirit of insurrection having been manifested among the Negroes of German coast renders it indispensable to reorganize without delay the 5th Regiment of Militia, lately under your command. So it's Christmas Eve, and instead of worrying about any celebrations of the birth of Jesus or anything like that, you've got the territorial governor worried about a Black insurrection up the coast at the German coast from New Orleans, as you can see about where that is on the map, and many of you probably know where German coast is anyway. Well, implied in this document, I think, is a very different kind of impression of what Christmas was like in the South during what we sometimes call slave times than what most of us have. Now, what is the conventional view of Christmas time in the Old South before the Civil War? Well, the conventional view is a time of great celebration for whites and great celebration for enslaved people also. The usual view is that they had considerable time off from labor, that they had the freedom to roam about at will. Most of the time they had to get written passes from their masters to be safe on the roads. But at Christmas time, they could roam about at will. They could go into New Orleans if they were field hands on rural plantations. They could visit family and friends on other plantations and so on. The standard view is that they had lavish Christmas parties, feasts, barbecues, copious amounts of liquor, dances, and so on, and that they put on their best clothes for the holiday. This is an illustration from a New York illustrated newspaper a few years before the Civil War, that they got married over Christmas. There were joyous wedding celebrations. The dances were in seasonally decorated places where the masters supplying a lot of the decorations and, of course, the instruments for many of the slaves to play. They played fiddles and banjos and so on. And that the slaves got wonderful gifts over the holidays, all sorts of things: clothing, blankets, pipes, perfumes, tobacco, ribbon, candy and toys for the children, all sorts of extra food supplies, and even monetary gifts over the holidays. And they did the same thing whites did. That is, they hung stockings Christmas Eve and got many gifts on Christmas Day. And in fact, the servants in the mansion, in the big house, as it was known, the mansion on many places, would hang their stockings on the master's fireplace on Christmas Eve. And you can see here, in fact, that Christmas was a reciprocal occasion according to the way we usually think of it. That is to say, sometimes the slaves would go up to the big house to watch the festivities. They might be onlookers at the huge balls that the masters and mistresses threw over the Christmas holidays for visiting relatives and guests. And by the same token, the master and the mistress and the rest of his family and their guests got such a delight out of watching the enslaved people party that they came down to the slave quarters, the modest dwellings that the slaves lived in, and watched the slaves party. And they would toast each other over eggnog over the holiday, exchange Merry Christmas greetings and so forth. That's the usual view. Now, where does the traditional view of Christmas come from? We're thinking, after all, here about human bondage, something that we usually think of as a pretty horrible thing. So where does the usual view come from? Well, it comes from all sorts of documents from before the Civil War, including the autobiographies that enslaved African Americans wrote after they escaped to freedom. Some of them escaped on the Underground Railroad. And when they made it to the North or to Canada, they wrote their personal accounts of what it had been like to be enslaved in the South. And you're probably familiar with at least one or two of these. One of them was made into a movie a few years ago, a well reviewed and well attended movie. And it was based on Solomon Northup's book, 12 Years a Slave. He was actually a free Black living in New York who was kidnapped into slavery, kidnapped illegally, and sent down to a Louisiana sugar plantation. And his account was made into a movie. But you didn't get to find out what he thought about Christmas. If you read his actual account, you'll find out that this is what he said about the Christmas holiday. The only respite from constant labor the slave has through the whole year is during the Christmas holidays. It is the time of feasting and frolicking and fiddling. They are the only days when they are allowed a little liberty, and heartily do they enjoy it. They array themselves in their best attire. The table is spread in the open air. A ditch is filled with glowing coals, over which the chickens, ducks, turkeys, pigs, and wild ox are roasted. They are furnished with tarts and every manner and description of pies. Well, so you get a totally, you get evidence for this standard view of Christmas from autobiographies from enslaved people who ran away to freedom in the North and then wrote about it. You also get it from the letters and diaries of white people in the South before the Civil War. And in fact, it was the diary of one of a very wealthy white planter family, the daughter who kept a diary, and it was that diary that got me into studying Christmas in the Old South. John Quitman was one of Mississippi's leading planters, and he also owned a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He owned 4 plantations overall, and owned also a mansion in Natchez, Mississippi, known as Monmouth, which has been preserved and restored and is one of the most famous bed and breakfasts in the Old South. It was written up in Glamour magazine a few years ago as one of the most romantic places to take a honeymoon. And he had some 200 enslaved people. And you can see the inside of his big mansion here. And I was writing a book about him, so I wanted to read everything every document I could find, and I stumbled on a diary by his daughter Annie. And the neat thing was she wrote a lot about Christmas in the Old South in that diary. So years later, when I was looking for something new to write about and get more involved with, I worked on this Christmas book that we're talking about today. But anyway, her documents helped get me onto the subject. And she wrote all sorts of things about giving gifts to the enslaved people over Christmas and so on. But it's also the diaries of important politicians like and authors like Edmund Ruffin. Now, Edmund Ruffin is famous for being reputedly the man who fired the first shot on Fort Sumter. He was a famous Virginia agricultural reformer. And he kept this wonderful diary that has been published in 3 volumes. And I really think it's a great read on its own. And he wrote about Christmas. And for instance, one of the things he wrote about in his diary was taking his enslaved people down to his basement to watch a magic lantern show on Christmas Day, which showed a remarkable amount of intimacy, really, social intimacy between Black people and white people over Christmas. in the Old South. The magic lanterns were primitive kinds of slide projectors, and Ruffin is sharing a slideshow basically with his enslaved people on Christmas. So we get our information from sources like these and from letters that planters wrote. I'm missing one of my slides. That's okay. Maybe we'll stumble on it later. But planter Wade Hampton wrote to his daughter Mary in 1855, about 6 years before the Civil War. And Wade Hampton was a man who owned some 3,000 slaves. He had big plantations in South Carolina and Louisiana, and he's out west near his Louisiana place. And he writes a letter back home to his daughter. And he says, I have sent to New Orleans and ordered presents for all my people. Besides these gifts, they shall have a glorious Christmas, and I will do anything to keep them in good spirits. So letters like this know that slaveholders in the Old South purchased gifts for their enslaved people and wanted them to have happy Christmas experiences. White travelers, especially from the North in Britain, found the South a different kind of place, and they wrote accounts about it when they went through, and many times their accounts touched on what Christmas was like there. So you have an English visitor to the South writing, it is the day before Christmas. Towards the close of day commences the long anticipated frolic of Christmas Eve. The banjos and fiddles are brought forth. Dancing, singing, and revelry follow, only concluded by the approach of day. And newspapers in the South documented what was going on Christmas and all the partying that went on for not only the masters, but the enslaved people, which is the real focus of tonight's talk. And so, for instance, you have a newspaper in Franklin, Tennessee, talking about how African Americans gather together in the city over Christmas. And the paper says they had a grand time of it in our market house, about 100 of them in the full enjoyment of the Christmas holiday, such as shooting of squibs, meaning fireworks, such yells of delight, such hearty guffaws, and such uproarious jollity has rarely been witnessed upon our public square. So you have a lot of documents actually coming from both African American and white sources before the Civil War, validating that Christmas was a holiday for enslaved people as well as their mistresses and masters and their families. And you also have accounts published after the Civil War by people who had been slaves, explaining their experiences over Christmases during enslavement. And there were still autobiographies coming out after the Civil War was over by African Americans who had not published their books before the Civil War, but published them afterwards. And some of them were from rather famous people, especially one by Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was undoubtedly the most famous African American in the United States between Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the famed principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was, he knew very well leading white politicians like President Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, he made job recommendations to the Roosevelt administration for appointments for African Americans. He was known throughout the country. Many people read his autobiography, Up from Slavery, but he wrote many other things, and they were still reading Up from Slavery when I grew up decades ago. Anyway, in Up from Slavery, Washington wrote, during the days of slavery, it was a custom quite generally observed throughout all the southern states to give the colored people a week of holiday at Christmas, or as long as the Yule log lasted. In a magazine article that he wrote a few years later, he wrote, "Christmas was the great event of the whole year to the slaves throughout the South. And in Virginia, which is where he was enslaved, the colored people used to begin getting ready for Christmas weeks beforehand." Now, there were even more things published about being enslaved at Christmas time a few decades after Washington wrote, because in the 1930s, the New Deal, President Franklin Roosevelt's project to put people to work at a time of the Depression and great starvation and hunger and unemployment in America and so on, Washington, or rather the New Deal, put writers who were unemployed. It was hard to sell books at a time when people didn't have money to buy books. And so authors were put to work interviewing still alive former enslaved people. Now, these people were in their 80s and 90s, but as you can see from the slide, there were over 2,300 interviews collected of formerly enslaved people. They had a lot to say about Christmas, partly because they were specifically asked by interviewers whether they got holidays as enslaved people. So you have ex-Texas slave Charlie Sandals saying, "On Christmas, boy, did we have a time. Yes, sir. Master, he would have a big eggnog on Christmas morning, then he would give all the slaves some kind of present. Fireworks, candy, nuts, and the best of all was that dinner Christmas Day. Just anything a man could want to eat. On that day, the slaves he had was free to go anywhere they wanted or do anything they wanted to do." Now, at first, these interviews just sat in the Library of Congress, but they were collected and published in the 1970s. And Purdue University, where I taught, had a full run, all 41 volumes of these interviews, which was extremely helpful to me when I was doing my book. So they were available to find out about enslaved people's Christmases. But the point is, they weren't published really until the 1970s. And so you have to ask, what really shaped the attitudes of the American public in general, popular culture in America, in the early 20th century, through the time when I was growing up and into modern times. And it wasn't so much the letters and diaries that whites wrote before the Civil War. It wasn't so much the Black autobiographies written before the Civil War. It wasn't so much these sources that sat on shelves in the Library of Congress, but rather what I would argue was the most important source for portraits and understandings of Christmas in enslaved times in America, right up almost to the present, were the scores of books and other writings after the Civil War by white people about what slave times had been like. I'm talking about scores of autobiographies by white people, white slave owners especially, scores of works of fiction, both book length and short story fiction, poems published after the Civil War, speeches by white people, illustrations by white artists. Many of the writings went into multiple editions. And these vignettes of slave Christmases were so mellow, you couldn't help but almost wish, when you read these things, you could almost wish you were a slave. That's how much they portrayed Christmas as a wonderful time for Black people in America. And so this is an example of a book written by a white author who grew up on an Alabama plantation, semi-autobiographical. There is some fictionalization done, to be sure, called Diddy, Dumps, and Tots, a book for children. That was eventually, by the way, made into a play and staged at a part of Carnegie Hall. Many of the books had whole chapters on Christmas times on the plantation. That's how much they featured Christmas times in their recounting of what it was like before the Civil War. So this is one autobiography that had a whole chapter about Christmas at Chickarrow Wood. One of the men who wrote about Christmas a lot was Joel Chandler Harris, famous for his Uncle Remus stories. And he also wrote an autobiography about his time on a plantation during the Civil War, when he spent a lot of time with the enslaved people who told him the tales that later became the Uncle Remus story. So he had a whole chapter in his autobiographical account called On the Plantation. You can see something about Sandy Claus. This is very common. What I'm saying here is that these accounts weren't just single sentences or paragraphs. For the most part, they went on and on, page after page, about Christmas. And many of the authors of these books and articles and short stories and so on were propagandists for the Southern way of life and the Confederacy, especially members and officers in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I found that about half of these writings were by Southern white women, and a large number of these women were involved in one way or another with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, though the men had their own ties. Some of the men who wrote these things were former Confederate officers and former Confederate politicians. At any rate, that's who's writing these things. And here's the seduction that you encounter in these writings. These writings tell you, number one, that masters care about their enslaved people's welfare more than the health and welfare of their own white families. That's the impression you get. They're so caring of their slaves. And because the masters are so kind to their slaves over Christmas, the enslaved people themselves are very grateful for their master's care and are humbly appreciative of all the gifts. They curtsy and bow and smile and giggle as they get their gifts from their masters. You get the impression that every master and mistress knows every slave, even if they own hundreds of them, by name, even the field hands, not just their house servants, and that they individualize Christmas giving, that they go out on these shopping jaunts and they go to the stores and they buy presents that are individually selected depending on the tastes and yearnings of each slave. And if the enslaved people are old and infirm and the weather's bad and they can't come up to the big house to get their presents on Christmas, the masters and the mistresses trudge through the mud or the muck down and the snow down to the slave quarters to hand them out in person. And kind of the representative custom for these Christmas holidays in the South is a game they played in the mansion called Christmas Gift, where the idea of the game was whoever sighted someone else first thing on Christmas morning and yelled out, "Christmas gift," then the other person had to give them a present because they were caught in the game. And so although technically whites could claim gifts from blacks, this was a way to make Black people who have been, after all, working for free all year under the threat of the whip or sale or other abuse. It was a way for them to have a victory on Christmas Day over the people who in the South legally owned them. And so what would they do? Well, they'd hide behind stairwells, or they would hide in closets, or they'd bang on the master's door and then leap into the room on Christmas morning and yell Christmas gift and get a present. And we have all sorts of sources for this, and most of them are by white people. Here's Elizabeth Alston Pringle's account, Chronicles of Chickara Wood, and she writes in her autobiography, 1922, South Carolina slaveholder, of a former governor of South Carolina. I mean, she's the daughter of a former governor. She says, Christmas morning, very early, Merry Christmas, echoing all over the house. All the house servants stealing in softly to catch you, that is, say the magic words, Merry Christmas, before you did. Then joyful sounds, I catch you, and you must produce your gift. Such jolly, gay, laughing visitors, the stream coming all the time. And Susan Dabney Smeads writes about growing up on a Mississippi plantation. The dancing began in the piazza, a fiddle playing the gayest jigs with two heavy sticks knocking to mark the time, and a triangle and bones rattling in the most syncopated time. And all the young Negroes on the plantation, and many others from other plantations belonging to Papa, dancing, dancing, and dancing. Oh, it was gay. They never stopped from the time they began in the morning until 10 o'clock at night, more or less for 3 days. Okay, now, I want you to ponder the following, having been exposed to what I call the traditional view of Christmas. First of all, you must realize, as I've already mentioned, that this was the perspective of the political slaveholding elite of the Old South. Elizabeth Alston Pringle, who I just quoted to you, was not only the daughter of a former South Carolina governor, but her father had been an elector for the presidential election in the Confederacy. All of them were not all of them, but many of them were, they represented the elite in the Old South, the slaveholding elite. And astoundingly, some of them actually suggest that the masters put themselves out so much for their slaves before the Civil War that the masters were the real slaves in the Old South, because they cared so much about their slaves and they went out of their way to keep their slaves happy. They were the real slaves. That's what these books ridiculously suggest. Second of all, I think it's important to note that African Americans are provided with universally demeaning dialogue in these books that is supposedly and absurdly remembered word for word years later. If you read, and it's the same, no matter whether this is someone repeating the dialogue, the dialect of a slave in Texas or one in Virginia, they speak exactly the same. And they go on sometimes for whole chapters in dialect. I mean, it's absurd that someone in an autobiography can remember 10 or 20 pages about what their slaves actually said, word for word, before the Civil War. But that's what you get, for instance, in the memoir of LaSalle Corbell Pickett, who was the wife of Confederate General George Pickett, who almost everyone who reads about the Civil War knows was the Confederate general who led the hopeless charge up Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg. It was kind of the turning point of the Civil War. But she goes on and on with this dialect, and I just want to read a few lines of it, just so you get a feel for how demeaning it is. This is from Ruth McEnery Stewart's story, Duke's Christmas. It's a short story published in 1896. Now, Ruth McEnery Stewart was one of the leading writers of plantation romance and short stories, this kind of stuff. And she was from Louisiana. She spent her first 3 years on Bayou Teche, and then her family moved to New Orleans, where she spent much of the rest of her life. And at any rate, she has an ex-slave Mose tell his grandson, Little Duke, remembering Christmases before the Civil War when they were all slaves. And excuse me if this is a little bit offensive, but I want you to get a feel for it. All the darkies had to march up to der great house for day Christmas gifts. Old Master axed, not asked, but axed a blessing, and the string band play, and we all sing a song. That's just typical. So these books give slaves demeaning dialect. They also are clearly intended as propaganda. Southern white writers after the Civil War are still fixated, especially on Uncle Tom's Cabin, but all abolition literature before the Civil War. But Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you don't know, was the second best-selling book in the whole 19th century in the English-speaking world, and perhaps in the whole world, but it was second best-selling book to the Bible. And it talked about whippings on Southern plantations. It talked about enslaved people being sold away from their families and so on. And it was put on as a stage play. Southern whites still have a chip on their shoulder about this abolitionist work that made Southern slavery look bad. And so, for instance, you see this. Sometimes in the prefaces to these books, they actually say they want to prove Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author, wrong. You have passages like this: when enslaved people are dancing one Christmas in a Virginia writer's story, a character from the North says, "I wish Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe could see you now." One of the most representative of these tales is set partly in New Orleans, but in Louisiana. It's by a woman by the name of Marie Pointz, and it's called Henriette's Christmas, an episode of the olden days, and it was published in the New Orleans Daily Picayune. It's set on a plantation on the Mississippi River in Louisiana. There, enslaved darkies, and I'm using her words, sing joyously in the fields as Christmas time approaches. They get a week off every year for Christmas. They get a feast, dancing, they wear their best clothes. And the author writes, "Till far into the night, the thrums of the darkies' banjos echoed, and the glimpses of the Negroes dancing with infantile glee in the flickering firelight marked a phase in the life of antebellum days in the Mississippi that is for us in latter days the soft and lingering glow of an autumnal's twilight adieu." You can catch the kind of romance here, the longing for the old South. The story climaxes in New Orleans on Christmas Eve, when the master of the plantation sees a couple of people for sale who had once been the father and son of his plantation nanny. And he hadn't sold them, but a previous owner had sold them. He buys these family members and takes them back to the plantation, takes the chains off them, and on Christmas morning has a joyful reunion as a Christmas gift for his plantation nanny. She's now reunited with his family. These plots are really contrived with her family. These plots are really contrived, but they give a wonderful feeling about Christmas time on the plantation, Christmas or Southern white slaveholders and the like. Now, the problem with all this is less the factual errors than the erasures. In other words, some masters did throw big Christmas parties. Some masters did give nice gifts to their slaves. But the picture erases what happened elsewhere. Take James Hammond's plantation on Christmas Day. He was a very famous slaveholder, South Carolina U.S. Senator, but just listen to his diary for Christmas Day, 1854. Christmas cloudy and quite warm. Overseers dined with me. No festivities. Crops being lost and Negroes not having done their duty. He's saying, my enslaved people did not pick enough cotton, so I'm not giving them any Christmas holiday at all. You hear the same thing out of Black sources, like field hand Lewis Evans, who said about the place where he was, Master Major, give us Christmas Day and a pass to visit bout, but we sure have be back and report before 9 o'clock that same day. He was given a 1 day to travel around at Christmas, not a whole week. You need to keep in your rearview mirror the whole purpose of the Christmas holidays, whether the enslaved people got real holidays or not. It let unpaid forced laborers blow off steam. And this was openly admitted. That was the purpose. What was admitted was, if you give them enough of a party, they might forget how miserable they are the rest of the year. And so you have North Carolina Judge Thomas Ruffin. He's the Supreme Court judge in North Carolina, who said in one formal opinion that it was good to have Christmas holidays because of the exhilaration of their simple music and romping dances, and that it kept the slaves' minds vacant. It kept them from thinking of freedom, is what he was saying in an official Supreme Court decision in North Carolina. There was an advice manual published for giving, kind of like an advice manual today, which might tell you, how to make friends. But this 1851 advice manual was written to tell slaveholders how to keep their slaves happy and working hard. And it said, if you give them a holiday, they will perform their duties more cheerfully. Well, not all planters who gave their enslaved people holidays did so graciously. One South Carolina cotton planter, Thomas Chaplin, who kept a diary, wrote on Christmas 1848, last day of the holidays, and I'm glad, for then my Negroes will go to work. What about the claim that slaveholders gave extravagant gifts to their slaves? Well, it erases, first of all, the poor white farmers who owned almost 50% of all Southern slaves. They probably didn't give much in the way of presents at all on Christmas, but you rarely hear anything about them because, for one thing, many of them were illiterate and didn't keep diaries, but they were also poor. It's unlikely they gave their slaves much for Christmas. It erases the psychological purpose of the whole gifting process. When the master gives the slave the gift, and the slave then bows or curtsy and thanks the master profusely for the gift, it is a way of reaffirming the master's self-confidence and allowing them not to think that they might be doing something wrong, that their slaves might be unhappy. It erases the whole stinginess of the Christmas process. Thomas Chaplin wrote in his journal, December 25th, 1850, Wednesday, Christmas, Merry Christmas. Yes, merry to all the world but me. I only wish the Negroes were at work. I had nothing to give them but a few turnips. And plenty of formerly enslaved people in either their comments to the interviewers in the 1930s or in their autobiographies before the Civil War, talked about stingy masters. One wrote, "Christmas never meant no more to us than any other day. They give mothers sorghum and shorts to make ginger snaps." That's what she said during an interview. The novels and short stories that were published after the Civil War and well into the 20th century and up to modern times by white Southerners never mentioned this kind of stinginess or anything like that. More important, these books and other writings erased Christmas whippings and other forms of physical and mental abuse of enslaved people over Christmas. Take the memoir of Elias Cornelius. He was a Northern missionary. He had graduated from Yale. He had been licensed to preach, but he spent 3 months in New Orleans in early 1818. And in his account, he wrote about what had happened over the Christmas that had just occurred. And on Christmas Day, he had visited the penitentiary, or rather, excuse me, a hospital, where he'd seen a Black with an iron collar on him, and his leg was rotting. And he found out that over Christmas, because he had run away, he had been recaptured and confined in the plantation sugar house, which had no heat, and he had been given little clothing. And, quote, in this situation, remember, this is over Christmas, his foot had frozen and mortified. That night he went back and the man was dead. And this was hardly an isolated case. When an escaped slave was recaptured in one of Bennett Barrow, Louisiana sugar planter, when his slave was recaptured, he writes on December 24th, 1839 in his diary that he intends the next day to exhibit, quote, Dennis during Christmas on a scaffold in the middle of the quarter with a red flannel cap on. So he puts him in a scaffold. That's how Dennis celebrated his Christmas. Some slaves, including Frederick Douglass, talked about how their masters forced them to get drunk over Christmas to debase them, embarrass them, humiliate them, and make them feel dependent on their masters, that they couldn't possibly make it as free people. Frederick Douglass wrote about this, and so did the ex-slave Francis Frederick. He said his master made him drink copious amounts of whiskey over Christmas. What happened next? He would call us together and say, "Now you slaves, don't you see what bad use you've been making of your own liberty? Don't you think you had better have a master to look after you and make you work and keep you from such a brutal state, which is a disgrace to you and would ultimately be an injury to the community?" The accounts that were written that most Americans read about Christmas on the plantation also said nothing about holiday sales. It might shock you to know that slave sales went on over the holidays. Masters sold slave men, women, and children apart from their own families over the holidays. You never run into this in these romanticized, warm, fuzzy pictures of Christmas that we get in most of the literature. Now, once you recognize the limitations of slave Christmas stereotypes, you're ready to deal with the critical question of slave resistance over Christmas. And I'll just mention two things briefly. First, you are ready to grasp why a disproportionate number of enslaved people choose Christmas to escape for freedom. That's when they go. They forego the Christmas presents. They run away over Christmas because their masters are busy partying and don't have their guard up. They run away despite bitter weather, but they do it because they want their freedom. They're not enraptured by Christmas. They're not bought off by Christmas. They are abused and forced to labor all year round. And so among the slaves who ran away were some of the most famous, including not Harriet Tubman herself, but 3 of her brothers. She goes back to Maryland on Christmas Day, 1854, and rescues 3 of her brothers. They were supposed to be sold the very next day into enslavement further south in the slave trade. And she rescues them from that fate, gets them off their farm in Maryland, and takes them to Philadelphia, to the Underground Railroad head, William Still, who wrote a wonderful account of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, which also tells you the story of a lot of enslaved people who reached his station in Philadelphia over Christmas. So that's one way they resisted over Christmas. More important in many ways, I think, well, let me just read you this one quickly, because you see these ads in Southern newspapers right after Christmas. $50 reward, ran away from the plantation Robert English in Sumter District, South Carolina, about the 25th of December last, a Negro man named Jackson. Then it describes him and explains the reward and so on. So now let's go back to Governor Claiborne's letter that started this presentation. Remember, he's talking about reports of a spirit of rebellion on Christmas Eve, 1811. Well, what you find out is, although propagandists in the Old South and Southern newspapers, and Southern politicians in Congress constantly claimed that their slaves were happy, they knew better. And year after year, there were major Christmas insurrection scares in the South. There wasn't a single actual insurrection at Christmas, ironically, in the South. The most famous slave insurrection occurred in the summertime. That was Nat Turner's insurrection in Virginia. But year after year, they thought the slaves were going to rise up at Christmas, which means they couldn't have really thought their slaves were satisfied with enslavement or their Christmas presents. And then they would execute them. They would have roundups. They would have the equivalent of pogroms or Kristallnacht, whatever. And they'd round blacks up, and anyone who they thought was remotely suspicious, they might execute to make sure that the insurrection never actually occurred. So this is the diary of a Georgia plantation woman on January 1st, 1857. And I think you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. She's talking about Christmas just a few days earlier. This Christmas has been unusually quiet. The recent attempt at an insurrection has caused quite an excitement in Georgia, as well as in Tennessee. It was discovered before anything was accomplished in Tennessee. Numbers of Negroes were arrested. Several had their heads cut off. Others were hung, some severely whipped. It was stopped before Christmas. So much intercourse as there would have been might have enabled them to organize some extensive plan. Intercourse means gathering together, because remember, they were allowed to party, they were allowed to go into the city, visit other plantations. So much intercourse would have allowed them to organize a plan. The police in Augusta, that's Georgia, were very vigilant. I pray that that dreadful evil may never be visited upon our country. Year after year, this went on. This is North Carolina, Christmas Day, 1856, the Negro insurrections. This is copied from a Virginia paper. Every day develops some fresh scheme among the slaves of the Western and more Southern states. To those already reported in our columns, we're planned to add another prepared plan of insurrection just defeated in South Carolina, occurring in the same time in so many separate localities. They suggest a very general spirit of insurrection among the Negro population. Why should this state be exempt from the danger? It is not. And then talks about the danger in Virginia. It is a remarkable circumstance in all these schemes of meditated insurrection that Christmas was selected as the day for the slave revolt. And read between the lines. Here is Postmaster General of the United States, Joseph Holt, that Holt's in the picture, and he's visiting Charleston, South Carolina after Christmas. But, or rather, this is a letter to Holt, excuse me, after Christmas, and it's by the postmaster in Charleston explaining why he was too busy to visit with his boss, basically, on Christmas Day. And he said he preferred to be at this particular moment with the Negroes during the holy days, meaning the holidays, when excitement was most likely manifested. Let me translate it. Excitement means slave rebellion. So he can't meet with his boss. Sorry, boss, but I've got to be on the plantation in case there's a slave rebellion. This continues right up to the end of the Civil War. And in New Orleans, Christmas time, 1863, two residents, now New Orleans is occupied by the Union Army, and two residents of St. John the Baptist Parish petitioned the Union occupation officers that they'd better get arms out of the hand of some Black soldiers that they've recruited in New Orleans to fight for the Union Army. Why? You don't want Blacks having guns over Christmas. They know that 3 cartloads of slaves have just arrived in New Orleans, quote, shrieking threats. This is in their request to the Union officers. These Blacks are shrieking threats, singing and exciting to insurrection, and mentioning Christmas as the time set for the emancipation of the slaves. These Blacks who are going to serve in the Union Army are talking about Christmas as being the day to have a slave insurrection and end slavery in Louisiana. Let me end by arguing that the stereotype that was fed American popular culture by scores and scores of Southern autobiographies by prominent whites, by novels, by leading fiction authors, by poems, by illustrations in magazines, by newspaper accounts, interviews, and so on. And speeches. I would argue that these images are highly misleading and that they buttress race divisions in America up to the present, that you could see it until the last few years in many plantation holiday tours, the famous candlelight tours at Southern plantation sites, and that you would be crazy to ever want to be a slave. They were so mistreated. And I think a city editor of an African-American paper in Norfolk, Virginia, made my point much better than I do, but it's sarcastically, in 1965, when he said, "Bring back slavery and I'll join up. Regular hours, job security, a cozy hut, and a free drink at Christmas." Well, in the end, I want to give the great Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois the last word of the dangers of buying into romantic mythologies about the South, slavery, and Christmas. He said that if you present false mythologies about slavery, and you obliterate the real Black history, you are leading white people in America, quote, to embrace and worship the color bar as a social salvation, and it is helping to range mankind in ranks of mutual hatred and contempt. And that is my program for today. And I'm going to stop my screen share and throw things over to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. May, for your presentation. We're going to get started with the Q&A. So if you could throw your questions into the Q&A function rather than chat, I am going to be reading those questions to Dr. May. And I'd actually like to start with a question of my own. You touched on this very briefly right at the end, but one of the reasons that we were so excited to find your work is that we, are a historic site that is trying to place at the forefront of our interpretation the experience of enslaved people. And since we have embarked on this, now when it comes to be Christmas time, we come to our traditional Christmas time tour. What do we tell people? It's easy enough to find these narratives about Christmas, the ways in which enslaved people might be included in Christmas celebrations. And we know that can't be the whole story. And so your book gives us it fills in those gaps that we knew must be there. So we were really happy to find it. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the role of historic sites in sort of perpetuating this mythology.
Well, thank you, Dr. Medvick. I really think I think over time they did play a major role in perpetuating it, the romantic view. And I think sites like yours, but many sites in recent years have changed. And I've been studying this year, and I've been actually corresponding with other site directors and also reading the promotional information on holiday events online. And my impression is that the traditional holiday tour has been pretty much erased, except the only case that I've seen online that suggests differently is down in Sarasota, Florida, where there's a historic site run by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And although I haven't attended their Christmas programming ever, I suspect that it's presenting the kind of warm, fuzzy view of the enslaved experience. I suspect it still is. But what I found, I don't know exactly what's causing the change, but I think it's several things. Obviously, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville had a profound effect, as did the Black Lives Matter movement. COVID gave us a time to pause. Many tours were canceled. And we simply have much more written by historians. I think they're just, we're much more sensitive to Black perspectives in general. And you put all these different forces together and things were bound to change. So whereas once upon a time, enslaved people at some places weren't mentioned at all, at others they were dressed in livery, dressed up, taught to smile, bring drinks to guests, the hot apple cider that was served in many mansions and things like that, and or maybe playing instruments or answering the door, that kind of thing. Their lives weren't seriously engaged. And starting, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there were more and more that you were beginning to have visits to the enslaved quarters. But of course, I think the problem, and then what comes up is you may not have documents from your own site that will, some sites do. I mean, Jefferson's mansions, they have so many Jefferson letters and papers from his family that they do know what happened at Christmas. And similarly with George Washington. So there are sites that can actually say, this is what happened on our site. But on other sites, I think you have to borrow from sources like my book. And what you tell people is, this is the, it varied at every place, but this is probably more or less what happened. And give them both sides and drum in some of the points I was trying to emphasize towards the end of the lecture or towards the end of the presentation. I think that's about what you have to do. I don't think you can hide it any longer, and I don't think many sites are. And I especially think it's also important to address it in your advertising. What bothered me the most of a lot of sites years ago wasn't so much that they served a nice holiday meal or put up wreaths on the doors and lit up the beautiful gardens and so on. It was the advertising, which said things like, come join us for a magical Christmas experience on the plantation. Go back in time to a magical bygone era, and that kind of thing. And I think if you were an African American, and I know those tours occasionally got African American visitors, but I imagine that most potential African American visitors must have just gagged on such language, and it must have been highly offensive. Celebrate a plantation? Well, their ancestors on that or other plantations easily could have been whipped, abused in many ways, sold away from their families and so on. And I only was able to touch on this in my presentation tonight, but my book has a whole chapter on slave sales and things like that over Christmas and slave abuse. One ex-slave worked at a tan yard, and he played that Christmas gift one year on his master, but his master was in a bad mood. And that's the thing, you never knew if your master or your mistress might be nice most of the time, but if they were ticked off about something, they got even, and they took it out on their slaves. It was easier than taking it out on your own wife or your own children. Slaves were handy targets. So this enslaved African American approaches his master one morning, and he says, "Christmas gift, massa." And the master was in a bad mood. He threw him into the tanning vat, and he could have just drowned in the vat, because every time he tried to climb out, the master threw him back in. And finally swam to the other side and got out and lived to tell about it and ran away to freedom. But that was on Christmas Day. I mean, all sorts of weird things could happen. You could spill the holiday wine on your mistress's dress and get whipped for it or otherwise abused. And so anyway, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting update on what you talk about in your book, where you talk about a lot of the really sort of more the traditional view of this romanticized Christmas being perpetuated on historic sites. And it's great to hear that is apparently changing a bit.
I really think it is. I even got a script from one site, and it's remarkable. I mean, it just talks about how they were depressed because if they weren't sold over Christmas, they knew that January 1st, New Year's Day, was the day when a high percentage of all rented slaves in the South were rented out. And I think that's one of the things that many of your attendees today probably, if there were something about enslavement they don't know, it's probably the one thing they maybe have never thought about. But a high percentage of enslaved people were rented out because for one reason or another, the master might have too many enslaved people to tend the crops. So you might get rented out to a railroad company, you might get rented out to an iron mill or a coal mine or a tavern, jockeys. There was a whole book written a few years ago. It's an excellent book about enslaved jockeys. They were rented out from planters who had too many slaves, and they were rented out to become jockeys at horse races. And they were rented out for all sorts of things, but usually they lived away from their families if they were married and had kids, maybe for the whole year. They were rarely given visiting passes. And then no wonder they get married at Christmas time. It's the only time they got back to the original plantation in many cases. So of course the weddings were saved up for the Christmas holidays. But if you knew you were going to be rented on Christmas Day, and they weren't always rented to the same person or company, so you might have a good experience one year, but then you spent the whole Christmas time wondering who you'd be rented to next. And so that's an indefiniteness that hovered over any Christmas custard you were given at the big feast, or any dance you were allowed to attend in the master's barn. And so it could be very depressing. And so I really don't want to give the impression that no slaves were happy over Christmas. That would be really misleading. But unless you give a nuanced picture and talk about the fact that nothing was ever guaranteed in enslavement, and that large numbers of slaves didn't get long holidays, and that maybe many of them didn't even get big feasts because many of them were owned by fairly poor people. You put it all together, it's really a misleading it'd be very misleading to go out with the romantic picture that you get from many novels and short stories. Some of them are still being published. It was shocking to me to check and find out how many of these have been published in recent years, even by university presses, because they're considered historical documents. If you have the daughter of a South Carolina governor writing her autobiography, it's just as valid today as when it was written. I mean, it's her view of life in the Old South, and it's very informative in many ways. And so you republish it, and it's been republished several times, and it's got this whole chapter making Christmas sound like the most wonderful time of the year for everybody, and everyone's happy, and you know, they're all just partying up a storm, and you wouldn't think that anything else ever happened on Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you come across any sources? This is from one of our guests. Any sources that talk about holiday or Christmas experiences for enslaved people in urban settings rather than on plantations?
Yes. Well, you'll remember I did read that one document from the Franklin, Tennessee newspaper. That was, Franklin was one of the most important battles of the Civil War, actually. It would be in Franklin, Tennessee, and it's not far away from Nashville, and well, it's not a big city. It was still, you know, an urban setting. There are lots of accounts in Southern newspapers, especially of slaves partying in Southern cities over Christmas. And then there are other accounts like William Sims, the famous Southern author. The most famous Southern writer before the Civil War was William Gilmore Sims, and he wrote all sorts of novels and other writings. William Gilmore Sims wrote about going in one Christmas to shop, and he came in from his plantation on a railroad, and he wanted to go back, but he said, I had trouble buying a railroad ticket because there were so many blacks in town celebrating that they, you know, I couldn't buy a ticket. The crowd was, I couldn't elbow my way through the crowd at the train station. So we have lots of accounts like that of rural blacks coming into the city, whether it's New Orleans or Richmond or wherever, and coming in for the holidays. And they did, you know, free blacks were free. That's another aspect of slave times that a lot of people don't know. The South had about 4.5 million African Americans, but at least 300,000 of them were free. They had been legally freed by their masters. They carried papers saying they were free, so that if they were stopped on the roads, you could be whipped if you were stopped on the roads without papers. If you were stopped, you could show your papers, and it said it said you were free. And I mean, the papers showed that you had permission to travel if you were a slave, but if you were free, they just said you were free. And so there were all these hundreds of thousands of free blacks, and they had money. Some of them made a good living. One of the wealthiest free blacks lived in Natchez, Mississippi. He was a barber, and he kept a diary, and he cut the hair of General Quitman, who I put up there. And I meant to mention that John Quitman, who had the daughter who got me into this project with her diary, he was governor of Mississippi. He was also congressman from Mississippi and led the troops into Mexico City in the US-Mexican War, and also tried to conquer Cuba and make it a new slave state. So he was Mississippi's most radical secessionist before the Civil War. And his hair was cut by a black barber named William Johnson, who kept a wonderful diary, and it's been published. You can buy it and read what well, he had money. You know, there were lots of Southern free blacks who had a decent amount of money, could spend it and go to stores and shop at Christmas, just like white people did. And they had their own parties and so on and so forth. So, but there was also intermingling with free blacks and enslaved people over Christmas. And in fact, there were some fears that were expressed by Southern whites that slaves would get the wrong idea by mixing too much with free black people.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions here that are kind of connected. One is following up on this one. So one guest is wondering if you've come across any instances where enslaved people who were allowed to celebrate discuss any specifics about where their fanciest clothing came from or where their meals came from, aka were enslaved cooks or enslaved seamstresses making the very gifts and the very meals that the enslaved people were enjoying. And likewise, any enslaved people working in a household, whether in a city or in a plantation, who were doing that domestic labor, did they get the same kind of time off, if at all, that someone who worked on a plantation may have sometimes?
What an incredibly wonderful question. First of all, the truth is that field hands more consistently got Christmas Day off than the house servants, because the house servants, it was really a big thing for white Southerners, first of all, to have large families. Quitman's wife had, I think, 11 kids in all. A couple of them didn't live, but those kinds of large families were very common, and they often lived nearby. And so they would come in from nearby areas for, especially to the rural plantations, for a big, holiday on the plantation. Well, how in the world are you going to cook those meals? And so often the plantation cooks and then the servants would have to be there to serve the meals. So I'm not saying that no slaves got Christmas, no servants got Christmas off, but it's a mixed picture. And on a lot of places, they actually paid them wages for Christmas, for more or less for overtime. You actually had money wages paid that slaves could use for things that they wanted if they were willing to work on Christmas. And so sometimes it was forced, sometimes it was paid. Also, and there's even a short story that some blacks found offensive that was criticized, that suggested that the slaves in the house were jealous of the field hands because they got more time off. But at any rate, the similar things happen with the field hands, but to a lesser degree. That is to say, sometimes they actually needed the field hands to work over Christmas. Now in Louisiana, that's a very important issue, because sometimes the sugar crop wasn't all in by Christmas, and the planters would just make them work straight through the holiday to make sure that the cane didn't spoil in the fields. And it had to be processed and it had to be rolled in the mills before it was really safe. And they would give them their holiday in January. So some field hands didn't get a holiday at Christmas, depended on the year, and so on. Also, throughout the South, enslaved people were expected to do some daily chores over Christmas. So while they might not be digging ditches or, plowing fields under or whatever over Christmas, they might still be expected, especially, to take care of the stock. You still have to feed your stock and care for them. And so some were fed, some were given wages, some weren't. As for the question of labor prior to Christmas, of course, there's a lot of written testimony that, number one, the slaves helped with the butchering of those hogs. Sure, they didn't get meat all year long on many places, perhaps most places. Christmas, they got duck, turkey, hog roast, beef, cattle were slaughtered, hogs were slaughtered, and so on. Who did the slaughtering? Well, you might be under the direction of an overseer, but you can bet that on most places it was the slaves themselves that did the slaughtering of the meat that they'd be enjoying, which is part of the reason they're singing before Christmas and having a good time in the fields. They probably did sing a good share of the time in the weeks leading up to Christmas because they knew they were slaughtering animals that they would dine on. And so, yeah, they slaughter but and similarly with the sewing of clothes. Elizabeth Fox Genovese, in her book about Within the Plantation Household about Southern white women, pointed out that when Southern white women, and I've seen this elsewhere, often use the term I, sewed 30 dresses today, or 100 dresses, or I got 100 dresses sewed today, they meant they were directing servants in the needlework and so on. And so I'm not saying that all enslaved people made all the presents. Masters definitely went to town to buy gifts for their enslaved people. And so when Wade Hampton wrote about, sending off to New Orleans for gifts, he meant it. That he wasn't writing for later historians. He was writing a letter to his own daughter. And we have plenty of documents that show that supplies had to be purchased. Some of the, toys and candy that were sold, that were given out on the plantation on Christmas Day, they were bought. They weren't raised on the plantation. But I would add one other thing that should be obvious to almost anyone, and that is that a good share of the presents were necessities. That is to say, when you give an enslaved person his one pair of shoes for the entire year at Christmas, what are you really saying? Well, you're saying I'm not giving him shoes any other day of the year. And if I didn't give them on Christmas, surely I'd be giving them some other day of the year, because if not, the slave can freeze to death. If you go without sufficient clothing, sufficient shoes, you can pick up diseases from the field if you don't have decent shoes. You just have all sorts of problems. And so a lot of these were necessities. If they gave them extra flour or extra cornmeal over Christmas, or whatever they're giving them, they have to have enough calories to work. And so just like they got psychological sustenance, which is what the advice manual was saying, it's important for their psychology to be happy for a few days. They'll then have if you work, in other words, it was saying really, if you work someone 365 days year round, you never give them a minute off, they're going to get to hate it. And you've got to give them some release. It's like a steam pot. You've got to let that steam escape or it's going to explode. And that's what these advice manuals were saying. Well, similarly, you've got to give them some time off at Christmas, give them a few gifts. It makes them feel good a little bit and eases a bit of the burden. And that's why Solomon Northup, who did want to be free, and he eventually was rescued out of enslavement, that's why he said they enjoyed their Christmas party. It was a chance to blow off steam. And I think it's interesting that Northup also said that we were busy eating and dining and getting married over Christmas instead of running away. That's what Northup said. But our minds were diverted, and the drinking did the same thing. Not every slave was forced to get drunk, but just to have so much liquor available. Why do many people drink? Well, to forget their worries. And it was better that than that they slit their master's throat. And by the way, I should add, I didn't mention this because I just didn't have time, but some masters' throats were literally slit over Christmas by their slaves, and some overseers' throats were slit. And You don't have a major slave rebellion over Christmas, but you've got 4 million enslaved people by the Civil War, 4 million. And to think that none of them would strike a master or an overseer, kill a master or overseer. We're not talking about large numbers, but here and there, they did it, and they did it on Christmas. And we have plenty of documentary evidence of that.
It's fascinating. It is 7:30. So even though we have lots and lots of great questions in the Q&A, I'm going to have to wrap things up here. But let's give another round of applause to Dr. Robert May. Thank you so much for your presentation. On behalf of the Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, I would like to thank Dr. May for speaking with us this evening. And for information on the upcoming lectures in the Gallier Gathering series, please visit hgghh.org. And I'm actually particularly excited to announce that starting next month in January 2023, the Gallier Gathering series will be hosting the LEH Currents reading series called Witness to Change: Community Conversations on Coastal Impacts. Currents is a program of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and is made possible by the state of Louisiana. This series will be a little different from our usual Gallier Gatherings format. It will feature 4 discussion nights led by environmental humanities scholar Dr. Christopher Scheberg from Loyola University, New Orleans. Each night focused on a key text that deals with the changing landscape of water in the United States. These texts, which include both fiction and nonfiction titles, deal with the personal and community stories that lie at the heart of issues such as rising sea levels, land loss, extreme weather events such as that we had this evening, and drought. Our first discussion night will be on Elizabeth Rush's Rising: Dispatches from the New American Shore on January 11th, 2023. Participation in these in-person discussion nights is free and includes a copy of the book, but spots are limited. So if you are in the New Orleans area and you're interested in participating, please visit hgghh.org to find the link to register. And once again, I would like to thank Dr. May and thank you, our audience, for your continued support of our museum. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Gallier Gathering. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you for having me. Good night.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.